What if I told you that your biggest financial decisions, your most rational life choices, have never truly been your own? That beneath the surface of every market crash, failed policy, or personal setback lies something far deeper, something hidden in your own mind. Today, we're peeling back that curtain. Welcome to the podcast breakdown of Misbehaving, the Making of Behavioral Economics by Nobel laureate Richard H. Thaler, a masterwork that dismantles the myth of perfect rationality and exposes the real drivers behind human behavior. This isn't just theory. This is the weaponized truth about how decisions are made in governments, boardrooms, and your own brain. And by the end of this episode, you won't just understand these game-changing principles, you'll master them. Why? Because we've engineered a power-charged knowledge check, a challenge designed to rewire how you think, test what you've absorbed, and supercharge your cognitive edge. Stick with us, because not only are we unlocking a complete summary of the book's most disruptive insights, we're also dropping a surprise that could permanently shift how you approach every decision from now on. This is not a conversation, it's a revolution. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something really fascinating, behavioral economics.
Yeah, it's a great topic.
We're going to be looking at it mostly through Richard Thaler's book, Misbehaving.
Exactly. And it's less about dry theory and more about, well, how actual people make decisions. Thaler's own experiences really drive the story.
Right. He sort of chronicles how observing real human behavior challenged those older economic models, the ones with perfectly rational actors.
The econs, as he calls them.
Yeah, the econs. So our mission here is to unpack the core ideas, how we humans stray from that pure rationality.
And what that means in the real world, for your own choices, for markets, even government policy.
Okay, let's dive in. Where did this whole focus on the human element in economics even start?
Well, it really kicked off when people like Thaler started noticing, inconsistencies, behaviors that just didn't fit the standard economic playbook.
Things people did that seemed, illogical?
Pretty much. Thaler talks about seeing these odd behaviors back when he was a grad student, things that made you scratch your head if you only thought in terms of pure rationality.
Okay, like what? What's a concrete example of this difference between humans and econs?
Well, think about the basic econ model. They're supposed to be perfectly rational, always maximizing their utility, totally unaffected by biases.
The ideal decision maker.
Right. But humans, we're messy. We've got emotions. We take mental shortcuts. All sorts of psychological stuff influences us.
So how does that show up? Where do humans really differ from econs?
Okay, take sunk costs. An econ knows that money already spent is irrelevant to future decisions. If an investment goes bad, they cut their losses.
But humans don't always do that.
Not at all. A human might, say, force themselves to watch a terrible movie just because they paid for the ticket, or keep pouring money into a failing project.
Right, that I've already put so much in I can't stop now feeling, even if stopping is clearly the best move.
Exactly. Or think about planning meals. An econ planning for Friday isn't influenced by how hungry they are right now on Monday.
But a human shopping while hungry
buys way too much. Our current state leaks into future decisions in ways it just shouldn't for a purely rational econ.
And you mentioned gift giving before. Why is that weird for an econ?
Because cash is king for an econ. It's the most efficient way to boost someone's utility. They can buy exactly what they want.
But we often prefer thoughtful gifts, even if they're less efficient in cash terms.
Precisely. It shows we value things beyond pure monetary worth. There's symbolism, emotion. Econs don't get that.
And this idea that all money is the same, fungible, that's another econ trait we don't always follow.
Absolutely. We'll get more into mental accounting, but yeah, humans mentally label money. A tax refund might feel different, like fun money compared to salary.
Which makes no sense to an econ. A dollar is a dollar.
Right. For an econ, it's all one pot, allocated purely for maximum benefit.
So are these econ models just wrong? Should we throw them out?
Not necessarily. Thaler argues they're still useful as a baseline, a starting point. They show how things would work in a perfectly rational world.
Okay, so a benchmark.
Yeah, a benchmark. But to understand real economic behavior, you absolutely have to account for how actual humans, misbehave relative to that benchmark, especially for complex or infrequent decisions.
Got it. So these cracks in the traditional model started appearing. How did that lead to behavioral economics becoming a field in its own right?
A huge moment was when Thaler connected with the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, especially their prospect theory.
Prospect theory. What was so groundbreaking about that?
It was this major shift, from normative models, how people should decide rationally, to descriptive models, how people actually decide.
Focusing on reality, not just the ideal.
Exactly. Kahneman and Tversky brought psychology into it, giving a framework for understanding the biases and shortcuts we use.
Were there earlier hints of this within economics?
Oh, yeah. Herbert Simon talked about bounded rationality, the idea that we just don't have the mental horsepower to be perfectly rational. And some economists, like Baumol, proposed descriptive models. But Kahneman and Tversky's work was just more systematic, more psychologically grounded. It really took hold.
Thaler mentions they used a lot of hypothetical questions. Did economists push back on that? Like, that's not real money.
Oh, definitely. Big time. Many economists felt only real market behavior with real stakes counted. Hypotheticals were seen as, well, maybe unreliable.
But they revealed something important.
They did. Prospect theory turned out to explain a ton of real-world behavior, even in high-stakes situations. Those hypotheticals let Kahneman and Tversky isolate decision-making processes in a way looking purely at market data might have missed.
Interesting. So prospect theory laid the groundwork. Let's dig into some of the key concepts behavioral economists uncovered. Where's a good place to start?
Loss aversion. It's absolutely fundamental.
Okay, loss aversion.
It's the idea that psychologically, the pain of a loss is way more powerful than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Losses loom larger than gains. I've heard that phrase.
That's the one. Thaler uses this great story about his colleague, Professor Rosette, and a bottle of wine.
Oh, yeah. Tell us that way.
So Rosette buys this wine for, say, $10. Years later, it's worth $75. Thaler asks, would you sell it for $75? Rosette says, no.
Okay.
Then Thaler asks, okay, imagine you didn't own it. Would you buy it for $75? And Rosette says no to that too.
Wait, he won't sell for $75, but he wouldn't buy it for $75 either. That doesn't seem logical.
Exactly. That's the endowment effect, which is tightly linked to loss aversion. Because he owned the bottle, giving it up felt like a loss, and that loss hurt more than the $75 gain felt good.
Ah, so owning it changes everything.
It does. Not owning it didn't trigger that same sense of loss. Loss aversion is huge. It affects investing, negotiations, everything.
The endowment effect. So just having something makes us value it more. Is there more solid proof for that?
Yeah, the classic mug experiment. They gave mugs to half the participants, nothing to the other half, then allowed trading.
What would standard theory predict?
Roughly half the mugs should trade hands, right? If value is objective.
Makes sense.
But nope, far fewer trades actually happened. The people who got the mugs valued them significantly higher than those who didn't. They didn't want to sell.
Wow. So even random assignment of ownership creates this attachment.
It seems like it. It sort of inflates the perceived value in our minds. And like you said, it connects back to gifts too. Once we receive something, its value might go up in our eyes.
And it also explains why we resist change sometimes. Losing the status quo feels bad.
Definitely. Change often means giving something up, even if it's just familiarity, and that loss aversion kicks in.
Okay, powerful stuff. What's another key concept?
Let's talk about mental accounting.
Mental accounting.
Yeah.
Right. This is the idea that we treat money differently depending on where it came from or what it's for.
Exactly. We don't see all our money as one big pile like an econ would. We create mental buckets.
Like a holiday fund or emergency savings.
Precisely. And we might be weirdly reluctant to use money from one bucket for something else, even if it makes pure financial sense. Thaler mentions people using gas price savings to buy premium gas instead of just letting the savings flow into their general budget.
Huh. Yeah, I can see that. Or treating a bonus differently than regular salary. Found money feels spendable.
Totally. It really affects savings, too. People might keep cash in a super low-interest savings account while carrying high-interest credit card debt.
Rationally, you should pay off the debt first.
Of course. But the mental wall between savings and debt or spending money stops that logical step.
You also mentioned transaction utility. What's that?
That's the buzz you get from the deal itself, separate from how much you actually value the thing you bought.
So like feeling smug because you got something 50% off.
Exactly. Getting a good deal gives you positive transaction utility. Paying way more than you think something is worth feels bad negative transaction utility, even if you still really wanted the item. It's why sales are so powerful.
Okay. And we have to circle back to sunk costs. We touched on it with econs versus humans.
Right. It's our inability to ignore past investments, even when they shouldn't affect future choices.
Thaler's example of the guy with the tennis membership.
Vince, yeah. His elbow hurts. Playing causes pain. An econ would ask, does playing now give me benefit outweighing the pain? The membership fee is already spent. Irrelevant.
But Vince.
Vince feels he has to play to get his money's worth, to not waste the fee, even though it's making him miserable. Classic human thinking.
Okay, we're getting a good picture of these biases. What else is crucial?
Framing effects. This is super important.
How a choice is presented influences the decision.
Exactly. Even if the options are identical underneath, the classic is medical treatments. 90% survival rate sounds way better than 10% mortality rate.
Same statistic, totally different feeling.
Totally. Thaler also talks about narrow framing. We tend to look at decisions one by one in isolation.
Instead of seeing the bigger picture.
Right. Like evaluating each small investment separately, leading us to be too risk-averse overall, when taking a portfolio view might encourage more beneficial risks. We focus too much on the potential loss of this one thing.
Makes sense. What about willpower? Sticking to goals?
Self-control, or the lack thereof sometimes. It's that constant battle between what we want now and what's good for us later.
The marshmallow test comes to mind.
Classic example. Thaler uses this helpful planner-doer model. The rational planner in us sets goals, save money, eat healthy, but the impulsive doer often takes over in the moment. Buy the gadget, eat the cake.
The struggle is real.
It is, and it leads to time inconsistency. We value future rewards less the further away they are, but our valuation changes as the reward gets closer.
Okay, one more big one you mentioned. Fairness.
Yes, fairness. It's a surprisingly powerful motivator in economic decisions, often trumping pure self-interest.
People will act against their own financial interests if they feel something is unfair.
Absolutely. The ultimatum game is the textbook proof. People will reject free money if they think the proposed split is insulting or unfair.
They'd rather get nothing than let someone else get away with being unfair.
Exactly. And Thaler points to real-world stuff, like the backlash against businesses price gouging during emergencies.
Right. Raising shovel prices after a blizzard, bad PR, even if supply and demand justifies it.
People have a strong sense of what's fair, often based on a reference point. The usual price, the established terms, violate that, especially if it seems exploitative and people get angry.
It's clear these ideas aren't just academic. How have they been put into practice?
Well, a big example is the UK's Behavioral Insights Team, or BIT, often called the Nudge Unit.
Nudge unit, I like that.
Yeah.
So they use these behavioral principles to shape policy.
That's the idea. Gently nudge people towards better choices without forcing them. Thaler discusses some of their work.
Like what? Any successes?
One famous one was changing the wording on tax letters. Simply adding a line saying, most people in your area pay their taxes on time, significantly boosted payment rates. It leverages social norms.
Wow, such a small change.
Yeah. Others are more complex, like encouraging energy efficiency. Sometimes nudges work, sometimes not as expected. But things like automatic enrollment in retirement savings plans, huge success.
Because it uses inertia. The default option is powerful.
Exactly. It makes saving the easy default path. That's a classic nudge. It's based on this idea Thaler calls libertarian paternalism, guiding choices for people's own good, but keeping their freedom to choose otherwise intact.
Interesting balance. Okay, so these insights are useful for policy. Yeah. How do they challenge older economic theories, especially in finance?
They pose a big challenge to the efficient market hypothesis, the EMH.
The idea that market prices always reflect all known information, so you can't consistently beat the market.
Right. But behavioral finance points to anomalies the EMH struggles with.
Such as?
Well, there's the loser effect. Stocks that did badly in the past tend to outperform past winners later on. That's hard to explain just based on risk. And stock prices seem way more volatile than changes in the actual company fundamentals, like dividends would suggest. Robert Shiller showed that. It implies something else is moving prices.
Like irrational exuberance or panic.
Kind of. Behavioral finance talks about noise traders, people trading on sentiment, gut feelings, biases, not just cold, hard facts.
Yeah.
And investor sentiment itself seems to drive bubbles and crashes.
We even see this in things like game shows.
Yeah. Thaler mentions studies on shows like Deal or No Deal. Even with real money on the line, people's decisions show predictable patterns of risk aversion and loss aversion that don't quite fit standard expected utility theory.
It's not just amateurs, right? Even professionals can misbehave.
Definitely. Thaler points to the NFL draft. Teams consistently seem to overvalue high draft picks, maybe due to overconfidence or sunk cost fallacy about the scouting effort.
And coaches making bad calls on fourth down.
Yep. Statistical analysis shows coaches are often too conservative. Punting when going for it offers a better chance of winning. Fear of failure, perhaps. It shows even high-stakes pro environments aren't purely rational.
All this really hammers home the need to base economics on how people actually are, not just how they should be.
Absolutely. Which leads to the final key point. The bedrock of behavioral economics is empirical observation, watching real people.
It started with Thaler, just noticing odd things.
Yeah, he talks about keeping lists of these anomalies, these deviations from the standard model, just collecting examples from everyday life.
But it became more rigorous than just anecdotes.
Oh, for sure. Lab experiments became crucial for isolating biases, like the mug experiment we discussed. They let you control variables and see what's really driving the behavior.
And then testing it in the real world.
Increasingly, yes. Moving from the lab to check if these biases hold up with real stakes, like in financial markets or policy interventions. It's that mix observation, experiment, real-world testing that gives the field its strength.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. As we finish this deep dive, what are the main things we should take away from Thaler's work and behavioral economics?
I think the biggest thing is just, we're not econs. We humans are predictably irrational, you could say. Our psychology deeply influences our economic decisions in ways the old models missed.
And understanding that is really important.
Hugely important for understanding ourselves, understanding markets, designing better policies, you name it.
Yeah, I feel like concepts like loss aversion or mental accounting, they're not just terms anymore. You can really see them happening all the time.
Hopefully you, the listener, feel that too, that you've got a better handle on these forces shaping your own choices in the world around you.
Definitely. So here's something to chew on. If these misbehaving tendencies are so powerful in economics, where else could these insights be really useful? Think about management or law or even just, personal relationships. What other irrational behaviors out there might actually tell us something deep about how humans tick? Something to think about.
A great question to end on.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
You've just absorbed the mental artillery of Misbehaving, a book that didn't just birth a field, it redefined how we see ourselves. But if you stop here, if you simply nod and scroll on, then nothing changes. And make no mistake, those who ignore this knowledge are already losing ground. In careers, in finances, in life. We're not living in an age of logic. We're living in an era of behavior. Those who understand the irrational win. Those who don't become predictable, replaceable, left behind. So act now. Hit subscribe if you're serious about rewiring your decision-making. Obliterate that like button if you refuse to live on autopilot. And dive into the description for all the tools, notes, and elite resources we've curated just for you. Because here we don't just read books. We weaponize wisdom. We turn insights into strategy, and strategy into real-world dominance. Up next, our expert panel will break these concepts down even further, revealing how top performers and global leaders are applying Thaler's insights to gain a behavioral edge. But first, your final challenge awaits. A custom-designed knowledge check, crafted to push your thinking, test your mastery, and ignite your mental ascent. Are you ready to prove that you don't just learn, you evolve? Let's see who's truly committed to transformation. The questions start now.